Good morning. On behalf of the ISO, I'd like to welcome you to the Storage as a Transmission Asset Stakeholder call regarding the latest status update for this initiative. I'm also joined by my colleagues in the room here today.
Peter Clower,
Neil Miller,
Brittany Day,
Deb Levine,
Carl Newson,
Bill Weaver.
Thanks.
Scott Bond,
Ryan Bellman.
Thanks, folks. As with all of our initiatives, the presentation and any related material on this webinar can be found on the Stakeholder Processes webpage, located on the drop-down menu under the Stay Informed tab on our website. And then you would notice this specific initiative under the Current Initiatives section. Our agenda for today's call, as you can see, is to review the stakeholder comments received to date, followed by a review of the scope and outstanding SATA market participation issues, and finally, next steps. In addition, the calls and webinars are recorded for stakeholder convenience, allowing those who are unable to attend to listen to the recordings after the meetings. Recordings will be publicly available on the ISO webpage for a limited time following the meeting. Of course, the recordings and any related transcriptions should not be distributed without ISO permission. Finally, if you have any questions in the room, please raise your hand by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad, and of course, announcing the name and the company that you represent. With that, I'll hand it over to Carl.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for calling in and for your patience, as I know we had hoped to have our third revised straw proposal out in December. But I wanted to take some time today to discuss what we've identified through that process, some of the changes we're contemplating in that proposal, so that as we move forward, folks can understand exactly what it is we're thinking on things. So I wanted to start quickly with a recognition of the stakeholder comments. We did, again, get a plethora of comments, so we always appreciate the engagement of our stakeholders. It's very important to the policy development. They fell typically into three categories. Some had additional questions about limitations in the proposed cost recovery options. As we mentioned in our Market Surveillance Committee meeting in December, we had looked to create some additional expansion/flexibility to some of those cost recovery options based on stakeholder feedback. Some of the various contractual terms, again, as we continue to work through the SATA process, we continue to enhance what we're able to offer in that process. But again, just a reminder, at the end of the day, the specifics as we boil them down for the final contracts will be developed through that contract development process. And then finally, the biggest challenges we've continued to encounter, is some of the questions regarding timing and notification of market participation. In our second revised straw proposal, we noted that we were prepared to allow for post-day-ahead, pre-real-time market participation, just given some of the complexity of the analytics and tests that we were looking at. This was, we received a significant amount of pushback from stakeholders on this proposal. That was, quite frankly, fully expected, and we immediately went back to the drawing board to try and identify ways to facilitate day-ahead market participation to allow for SATA resources that are allowed to participate in the market to basically compete with other resources for regulation and other ancillary services. So that's where we were, but again, as we continue to delve into the questions of notification, market participation, and some of the reliability-based questions, we had identified some issues that we'll note today that, quite frankly, are not necessarily specific to SATA resources. These are, I think, what you would call more general NGR or energy limited storage resource type questions, particularly as we're looking at constrained areas. This is a review, and I'm not a huge fan of going through things multiple times, but let's take a look at the scope and the background of what we're looking at in this initiative so that we can just get a sense of where the challenges have arisen. Specifically, we've noted that this is talking about resources providing reliability-based transmission services, economic or policy projects. We don't have a strong preference for whether it's transmission or distribution connected, providing we have a good line of sight and are able to utilize the resource as needed for reliability concerns. I think we've done a pretty good job, and stakeholders have been great about following along and getting up to speed and educated on some of the more detailed and nuanced aspects of our transmission planning process, the competitive solicitation, and the cost allocation for those transmission planning process resources. So, recognizing that our TPP is still running full speed ahead and evaluating the transmission needs and resources that are available to meet those needs. Also noting that the resource adequacy value of the resources, we've contemplated that these are transmission-based resources and would not be providing an RA value, so we saw that as beyond the scope. What was in scope, though, and what is also in scope is the cost recovery options and the idea of having the three criteria that FERC laid out and trying to make sure the ISO is able to address each of these, including market price suppression, ISO operational control, and double recovery of costs. And we're running into some of these challenges, particularly with the trying to assess the reasonableness of market price suppression, as well as thinking about how some of this market participation, notification, and tests would be facilitated. So the long and short of it is the hurdles we've been encountering are very much within the scope of market participation, but again, we're looking at them and saying, is this a SATA question or is it a storage or NGR question, making sure that we're able to maintain resources in a state of charge and availability such that they're there for the ISO when and how they're needed. But again, on top of that, we're also seeing some questions that are similar to some of the CPM/RMR type cost recovery questions and bidding and market behaviors that we need to address as well. So we're going to go through using a bit of the background of our proposals, our current consideration to help provide a little bit of context for some of the elements that we're still working through. So we are contemplating the 4 cost recovery options for regional SATA projects. Now again, option 1 is something that we're looking at for all FCs, which is to say 1-1 here, where they would have a must-offer obligation. Is something where resources that are participating in the competitive solicitation process may elect to have a full cost recovery that includes a must-offer obligation and would cover the maintenance. Now again, this was something that for direct assigned resources we were really focusing in on and saying there's really not a lot of optionality beyond that, though we are still exploring some other options for revenue sharing. The partial cost of service, the full cost of service with partial revenue sharing, those are options we've discussed in fairly significant detail over time. The only addition to that is we are still exploring, based on stakeholder comments, the idea of allowing direct assigned projects to have a market share with ratepayers, but keeping it at a fixed level, not to exceed a certain split where the ratepayers would be guaranteed a certain portion of the benefits of that market participation. Again, the whole point of FERC's proposal was to ensure that we are getting and capturing more of the benefits to ratepayers. The final piece of this is, again, noting that there is kind of some combination of options 2 and 3 that can be facilitated as well, which is to say, you can have some level of partial cost sharing and the proportions change, as well as having some split of the market revenues with ratepayers as well. So the challenges we're encountering now is trying to think through for particularly the direct assign projects, which have always created a bit of a different challenge, or resources that are selecting that full cost of service with the market crediting back to ratepayers, is we are working on what that must offer obligation would look like. We've heard lots of comments about establishing bid floors, or having specific offer obligations, or not having an offer obligation. But to the extent that we do propose that certain resource types, or project types, I guess is a more appropriate term, would have an offer obligation, we'd also propose that with that offer obligation comes an additional willingness of the ISO to cover all costs, including the upkeep costs that are caused from degrading the resource due to market participation. Now, the feedback on this is it basically starts to look a lot more like an RMR or CPM resource at that time, and so that some of the similar policy questions about, well, does this have the potential to lead to market price suppression continue to arise. So we've heard and understand that, and so we've looked at a couple different options to try and say, you know, we can have the market participation without having some of the inappropriate market price suppression that FERC has noted we should be concerned about. The first was putting a minimum bid price requirement out there. I won't say that this was universally loved by many stakeholders, but it did catch traction with some. The other thing that we've started to look at is opportunity cost bidding, thinking about how we would basically try and have an efficient dispatch of resources, again, comparable to some of the, again, policy concepts that we're looking at in the CPM RMR space. So let's take a look at these, some of the challenges we were looking at on this item, and then we'll pause for questions. Again, the minimum bid price was, well, some folks very much supported it. There's a recognition by a lot of parties that by imposing that minimum bid price, you are likely foregoing opportunities where the resource could be dispatched through the market at a somewhat lower price to the benefit of ratepayers. So we may not have, we may not be achieving the maximum benefit to ratepayers by simply saying that the resource would have to, let's say, submit bids for energy and AS at the caps for each of those products. And again, to the extent that we're also doing that, if we do need the resource through the market, we are going to be relying on exceptional dispatches more frequently for both charge and discharge than is probably ideal, simply to make sure that the resource is dispatched as opposed to simply allowing it to participate in the market a bit more unfettered. So we are also looking at opportunity cost bidding. Now, we've done this in a lot of places, including the commitment cost enhancements, phase 3, to facilitate an efficient use of use-limited resources so that to the extent that we have a limited number of starts for, let's say, a thermal resource due to air permits or warranty matters or whatever the justified rationale is, the ISO would calculate an opportunity cost to make sure that we got the best and most efficient use of those resources. So looking at and trying to consider how would opportunity costs work for a SATA resource kind of ran the natural transition to not necessarily being a SATA question, but really an NGR question, and recognition that some of the limitations that SATA resources would have are also comparable to what a storage resource more generally would also have. And so trying to develop that functionality became just generally important to the ISO. And as we looked at the methodologies we have in place, they don't currently fit very well with what NGR and SATA resource opportunity cost structures would typically look like, because again, it's not a question of simply dispatching at the highest priced intervals. It's really a question of optimizing the spread between charge and discharge capabilities and making sure that we get efficient use of the resource on both sides of that equation. For example, a resource would be better off charging it at a price of $500 and discharging at $100 than it would at charging at $0 and discharging at $250. So trying to contemplate those differences, looking at trying to develop opportunity cost calculations that would allow us to more efficiently utilize SATA resources is something that's underway presently, and something that we're exploring internally, and we expect that to the extent it has greater legs, we'll move that forward externally as well. So with that, I've kind of dumped a lot out there initially. Let's take a moment to pause for questions on, I guess, the first 10 slides. We'll go from there.
Okay. And we do have 2 questions in queue right now. I'll go to the first caller. Your line is unmuted.
Hey, Carl. This is Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum. I'm sorry, I joined a little late, so if you already answered this, I apologize. On slide 8, it goes through your different alternatives. Will there still be, I just wanted to confirm that there's still the option for a SATA resource to not participate in the market and get full cost recovery, just like today, right? Or are you taking away that option?
I think the objective here is to move storage resources that are participating in the market to some of the options we've got here, as opposed to maintaining the current, just you don't have a market participation option. I think what we've got here, though, particularly under option 3, is an option where you can come in and say, I'm going to get my full participation, and though the incentives are there, I elect not to participate in the market, and so they basically end up in a similar scenario.
I see. So if you had no intention of participating in the market, you would pick option 3.
Yeah, you'd be foreclosing, or you'd walk away from very stylized incentives to encourage participation, and so you would be leaving money on the table, but yes.
Okay, potentially. I mean, it's very hard to bid in storage. You could end up losing money, especially if you're under any sort of must offer. So we've just been hearing that there are some people who aren't interested in it, so I wanted to make sure that was an option. All right, thanks.
Yeah, and options 2, 3, and 4 do not come with must-offer obligations. Those are more incentive-based to try and drive participation through incentives, whereas option 1, because there are limited incentives for market participation, the must-offer obligation was something that we thought was more appropriate there. Okay, next question, please.
Okay, caller, your line is unmuted.
Oh, hi, this is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Can you hear me okay?
We got you, Susan.
Okay. I had a question on slide 10 and also just a general question. So would you go to slide 10, please? Okay. When you talk about the function of the spread between charge and discharge cost, what charge and discharge costs are you talking about? Are you talking about in a particular hour? Are you talking about the charge that, how would you know if they had filled the storage or charged it at different times, which charge cost would be applicable and which discharge? I'm just trying to figure out what you exactly meant by that, and then I have a more general question.
Yeah, Susan, that's a great question, and I think the unsatisfying answer is that the TBD. What we're looking at is potentially allowing for that functionality to be established by the SC for the resource, as opposed to trying to fix it in place for every market interval. And I think that at the end of the day, there's a lot of policy development that needs to happen around that, which is one of the biggest reasons why when we looked at this, we said, well, we see the benefit. We see, how it can work for multiple technology types, but it's not something that we're going to be able to solve here in SATA. We need to set it up more generally to work and function for all storage resources.
Okay, because it almost seems like if you didn't let them, oh, sorry, go ahead, I didn't interrupt you.
I was just going to reiterate, that policy is still to be developed.
Okay, because it seems like if you left people alone and let them develop their own bidding strategies, they would naturally look at some function of this. So it might not be something you have to mandate. But
yeah,
anyway.
and I think part of Part of no, it's a good point, Susan. Part of the efficiency gains that we're looking from this is to, you know, there's a certain amount of spread chasing, or trying to figure out and establish what that spread is and manufacture bids that that basically resemble what you want that spread to be, as opposed to trying to establish that functionality.
Okay, I'm not sure I got that, but I guess the TBD is fine. So for now. Okay, and then I had a general question, and I apologize if we're going to get to this later, but so the TPP is marching along, as you mentioned, and there was some question about trying to get some elements from this, initially, trying to get some elements from this initiative incorporated into any kind of phase 3 procurement that might happen out of the TPP. So what are your thoughts about that right now?
It looks like at this time we're going to miss the present TPP cycle. And I mean, this is kind of coming up to an inevitability that we had recognized anyhow, which is to say, even if we had board approval, that process of getting it through FERC was probably another 6 months along the line, so that competitive solicitation process was probably going to be going through, and it just wasn't going to happen. I'll get to, at the end of this call, what our goals, hopes, and dreams and aspirations for future cycles are, and the answer is we hope it's there and in place, but it's going to be a bit more contingent on some other elements at this point in time. So the long and short is we still have the opportunity, just as we have in the past, to consider storage resources to solve identified TPP needs. For this current cycle won't have consideration of the SATA initiative as part of it.
Okay, and then for a resource that might be picked, say, in that process, I think one of the things you might look at later is if you do then put this framework in place, that maybe there could be a transition or some kind of, you know, some kind of change, or would you just sort of say, well, that's it for this time, and, you know, nothing, you know, the future is the future, and whatever you get this time is what you get?
There's always what we get is what we get. The final terms under which they operate, again, we've got 2 storage resources out there now that have not been built and have opportunities to adjust the terms and conditions, I guess, to the extent SATA gets in place. But right now, we're not going to go back and reevaluate decisions we've made, obviously, once SATA is done and approved and locked in.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that. That's all the questions I have.
All right. Great. Thanks, Susan.
Okay. And I'm seeing no additional questions at this time.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. So moving on, as I noted earlier, we are looking at day-ahead market participation. We know and we understand why this was an important item for many stakeholders, and quite frankly, we walked into our first internal meeting after the stakeholder meeting and said, how do we make this work? So we started working with the presumption that we could get the day-ahead market participation to work. We looked at stakeholder comments. There's comments that say, well, just bump up the reserve margin. It's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. Forecasts change. The further out you are, the more they change. So we added a bit more of a buffer on that. But we were still looking at that as managing some of the load-based constraints, and all other constraints we thought, well, we think we can manage those through the marketplace. So if the load in the local area was going to be too high, we'd keep the SATA resource out of the market, and it would simply be available as needed on that day, and it'd be fully charged and ready for dispatch, and that we would utilize market dispatches to manage everything else. Now, we recognize, quite frankly, that that's being somewhat optimistic, and it does not resolve or adequately test for some of the flow-based needs or voltage-based needs that we would be potentially procuring SATA resources to alleviate. And so we looked at options for trying to develop tests for some of those flow-based needs, and they were not coming up. So, again, for the load-based test, we had a reasonable level of confidence that with that buffer, we would be able to make sure that resources were either in or out of the market as needed based on that load-based test. but we also want to note that once resources passed that load-based test, they weren't receiving some different treatment or some additional constraints that market resources or NGR resources providing market services would be receiving. And so we thought that there seemed to be a bit of a disconnect between how the market would then potentially deal with these two types of resources. And as we took a step back further, it's like, well, no, I don't know that there is a difference. We do want to the extent possible, let the market optimize them, and that just because a resource, an NGR resource is procured as an RA resource, let's say, that doesn't mean it's not needed and or providing similar voltage stability as a SATA resource. And so we do want to try and treat them comparably. As I noted, though, given the complexity, there's only a limited amount of these flow-based analyses that we can conduct. And so to the extent that we get one SATA resource, maybe it's doable, but it does add computational time to each market iteration. So when you add another one and another one on top of that, it starts to become exponentially difficult to assess all the potential needs. So absent an upfront test on the flow-based constraints that we're seeing, we need to establish some new protection for market dispatches, which is to say if we identify something in the day-ahead market that's needed, we need to make sure that there's nothing that happens through real time that could change that. Having the resource bid into real time, getting a day-ahead award, let's say, or a morning award when its day-ahead schedule was for an afternoon dispatch, we discharge the resource through the morning only to find out, oh, now we're sitting there looking at potential contingency events and we can't get the resource recharged. So these are the types of concerns we're exploring deeper. And again, this is not a SATA resource issue. This is an NGR issue for resources in locally constrained areas. So to the extent that we have a similarly situated market-based resource and it goes through the day ahead, gets an evening award, goes through real time, gets that morning award, we're still in the same situation, which is why we looked at this and kind of identified this as more generally applicable to NGRs. So we, again, want to make sure that these market functions work for all stored resources. Currently, if you're a thermal resource with one start per day and we start you in the morning, we do have the ability to run that resource through to the day. You know, it may not be the ideal solution, but at the end of the day, we still have it during that peak interval or that potential contingency event in the afternoon. So, again, we're seeing another scenario where the challenges we're seeing are not SATA-based, they're NGR-based challenges, and so we're looking to resolve that more generally. So I'm going to pause here to see if there are additional questions on this topic.
Okay, and we do have a couple of questions. I'll go to the first caller. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Carl. This is Alex Morris with the California Energy Storage Alliance. Thank you. Happy Monday to you.
Happy Monday to you too, Alex.
So just very broadly, I'm a bit worried that we're making perfect the enemy of the good here. And while I'm not saying CAISO's fully comfortable with a pared-down version of SATA, I am concerned that trying to make it perfect and have every market participation path is creating issues where we're not going to move forward at all in a timely manner. And maybe what makes sense is to try to carve off some of these issues so we have a smaller version of the SATA capability, but we can move forward more quickly. It seems like a big issue is when the resource must be participating in the market as a market resource, then how do we make sure it's not being cross-subsidized, et cetera? So if we carve off that one path, then do some of these problems go away? And also, you know, you've talked about some of these concerns about the NGR. And those are, my understanding is we're going to keep the TPP functionality for storage as a non-wired alternative. So we shouldn't worry so much about the deliverability issues of NGRs and contingencies, although of course we have to think about it. Contingencies are unpredictable, and so even how we buy ancillary services, we don't know if we'll have all of the right ancillary services in the right areas, so we approximate it with a regional procurement approach. So I think there's workarounds and solutions. I don't want us to throw the baby out with the bathwater here. That's one of my main points. So I'd like to hear your commentary on that idea and see if we could explore how to move forward expeditiously with a pared-down version, potentially.
So just really quickly, part of the answer to your question is going to come up in our next steps and our hopes and timing to resolve this, and the question of is the now better than the tomorrow? Is there some sort of differential based on putting things on hold now versus solving them in a few months? It really comes down to where do we stand for the next TPP cycle, I think, on that.
Yeah, Alex, this is Bill, too. I think it's worth noting that we've had preliminary discussions with a large number of people at FERC as well on where we are in this initiative, and certainly a significant number of the questions Carl's identified probably need resolution before we would take this to FERC. I think it would be very, very uphill kind of going with some questions unanswered.
Bill, that's helpful. And are those questions broadly in the category of cross-subsidization concerns?
Oh, man, Alex, I wish they were in one category.
Yeah, I was going to say, Bill, if they were in one category, it would be...
that'd be a piece of cake.
Yeah, we could at least focus. But again, FERC gave us three topics under which to that we had to address, and quite frankly, the initial conversations have covered all three in great depth and detail, and all pose some really fascinating questions to build on further.
Okay, and then, so on the slide you're showing now, slide 13, you emphasize the problem exists for all NGR resources in local areas. I understand what you're getting at here. The power flow challenges in local areas are certainly acute at times, and that drives a lot of the ISO's need determination. How is that particularly relevant for SATA? Because, Carl, just where I'm going is, to me, SATA is an accounting exercise in many ways, which is that we have a market participation path. We also have a transmission non-wireless alternative path already. The challenge that SATA is dealing with is when you combine those two paths in a time-differentiated fashion, whether it's one day your transmission, the next day your market, 1 month your transmission, the next month your market. We want to make sure that we avoid cross-subsidization and that the ISO has appropriate operating authority for transmission resources. So we got to work out any details there. Am I missing something here? Why are we drifting into just sort of more global concerns about the NGR model?
So I guess first off, we don't look at SATA as an accounting exercise, quite frankly. First and foremost, it's kind of it's an element to our transmission planning process and decision-making process, which is, I think clearly based on, operational needs. So it extends beyond kind of the accounting and cost recovery elements. It's determining how resources get selected. It's how they participate in the competitive solicitation process. So it's not just that. But again, we also are looking at this in the sense of when we go to operationalize a SATA resource and we want to utilize it in the marketplace, make sure that that we can do so effectively. And again, asking the questions of, if we were to develop tools, would we develop tools that are different from a market-based resource than we would for SATA-based resources once they kind of cross that threshold? Because, again, when we look at them operationally, we don't see a difference in that resource because it got procured as X or Y. We see an operational need, and that's what we want to make sure is structured in such a way as to provide our reliability.
I get that, and I think that the TPP contemplates how to do that. I mean, I know you can solve problems by locating generation in certain areas, or maybe by expanding the set of transmission solutions. That's another way to solve it. The TPP does contemplate whether the transmission path is the correct path, as I understand the TPP. So, Carl, I have a very specific final question, and then I'll get out of your way here. You know, throughout CAISO's comments in this initiative, we've been advocating that the energy ins and outs to a storage device when it's operating as transmission should not actually go through the market, so to speak. Those would be just like when you energize a transmission line, it may affect the market, and you may see losses or more, changes in prices. But you don't somehow force that transmission line losses to participate in the market. They don't have to schedule into the market. They're just an aspect of the system that the market compensates around. And so that's my specific question here is, when storage is a non-wires alternative, when it's just being transmission, are you still contemplating that it must participate in the market? And why is that? Why would it not just be UFE operated and controlled by the CAISO like every other transmission resource? So we can take this offline if that's unclear or too specific.
Well, so I guess the first piece of this that I'll emphasize is that part of what we understand stakeholders are looking for is clarity around how the resource is settled. We have gone through every single bill determinant charge code to provide that. That was anticipated to be part of the next straw proposal. It will continue to be whenever that next straw proposal comes out. So we will provide that clarity. But again, we are struggling to understand the idea of, how, I'm struggling with the question, but Debbie's kind of chomping at the bit here, so I'm going to.
Yeah, but so Carl, even your response to me highlights, we already have a transmission path, non-wires alternative. Do we not have settlement codes for that? And meanwhile, we already have a market path. Do we not have settlement codes for that? So I thought the settlement codes issue was addressed. Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, the transmission path and the market path are two different things. Part of the challenges you've got with a transmission path is that it sits there, it collects its cost of service as approved by FERC through the transmission access charge based on load and exports in the CAISO BA. For the market path, you're bidding and scheduling in the market, which from what we've heard, you want cost recovery for all of the charging that you're going to need to do in order for us to be able to discharge it. So it's not an apples to apples for a standard market participant, and it's certainly not just sitting there getting cost of service through rate base. So it's a new animal that needs to have a definition and a program set up for it.
Okay, yeah, and I appreciate that, and I don't mean to oversimplify it. But if a storage resource is a transmission resource for a whole month, and you need to turn it on to charge it, I agree those costs should be attributable to sort of the transmission world, and I don't think they at all should be routed through market settlements in any way. And we've been trying to articulate that. I think where it does become challenging is when you're dumping a resource from market to transmission across, consecutive days or inside a day. But if we take it to simple examples where you're a resource for a full month and the ISO wants to keep you charged, there's really no market settlements for that month. The resource is just operating as transmission pursuant to the ISO's direction as sort of the system operator. And when it turns on and charges, we don't want to have a market settlement for that. That's just UFE, one way or whether it's positive or minus. So we can keep working on this, Carl, but I continue to think that's a area of misalignment between CAISO's understanding and where the ISO is going. And I'm concerned about it because I think this is becoming a hang-up, whereas you guys continue to try and treat the transmission participation as if it needs to be settled through the market, when in fact I don't think it does, and I think it's just UFE. So I'll provide comments on that, et cetera, and I thank you for your time today.
Appreciate that, Alex. Any other questions on the phone?
We do have a couple more questions here. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, Carl. This is Cornelia Cusick from Center for Renewables Integration. You implied that FERC could give you 3 topics to address, or actually possibly somebody else in the room. Can you give us some insight into some of those other issues? Because it would seem that that's possibly part of why you guys are hitting the pause button and feeling that you need to go back and address some of these issues that are impacting NGRs as a whole.
Frankly, I think what we've identified here are the real core reasons why we're looking at the pause button. To simply say that the preliminary questions from FERC were challenging should not come as a surprise to anybody. It's a challenging topic. And we feel we are willing and able to address those, particularly on questions about would some of the options constitute a double cost recovery. That's a fair question that one can ask, and depending on your perspective, you can say yes or no to, for example, saying market revenue sharing is a double cost recovery. But again, those are not questions that are causing us to pause the initiative. I think we're able to, we've worked diligently with stakeholders to address some of those questions and understand why it does or doesn't. It's just a matter of us through a transmittal letter to explain to FERC and provide some of the answers to those questions, but we think we're ready to do so. So we've identified and put forward here what we think are some of the, I guess, Woe-Nelly kind of topics that are giving us pause, and there's really not much beyond that's causing us to pull back.
So then, if I understand you correctly, I mean, is it really if you already have NGR assets in the market, and so is this sort of you are, and I just don't think I necessarily grasped the first time you answered this, but so I realize this might be the second time you're answering it, but
okay.
Is the issue the fact that you're really you're going to now treat all NGRs that are already in the market differently, and so whatever solution you have in place for existing NGRs now has to be changed, or is that what you're saying?
I think the answer is I'm not quite positive that we necessarily have to go that far. I mean, at a minimum, we're looking at adding some additional optionality and functionality, which is not to say that the NGR model we have in place doesn't work well for some resources and technology types, but it's very much unclear that it works well for all of them. So it's at a minimum something we want to explore. We're going to do that imminently. Again, I'll get to that in my next steps slide, which I guess I should just give up on and just tell everybody. We're going to be looking to solve some of these issues in S4. Because I know I'm not going to make it all the way to the end slide before I just spill the beans on this, and start developing that again, because we see these as something, as topics that are generally applicable to NGRs. We've got a stakeholder process that's kind of on a rotating cycle, and it's doing a great job of solving issues as we identify them. And so trying to think about getting the general policy direction established through ESDR, and then having that be something we can adopt in SATA, because again, if it works for NGRs generally, it should work for SATA more specifically.
Okay. Yeah, so this is Peter Clower. So just to kind of reiterate and build on what Carl's saying. So in NGR, there's certain capabilities that work very well for batteries. When we came across SATA, as well as other scenarios where we need to look at the optimization in real time in a way that protects certain obligations, and this could be SATA, it could be RA, we're noticing that there are some improvements that need to be made to really beef up the ability of the NGR model in terms of optimization. So these are the things that we're going to be looking at overall within ESDR 4. And these aren't necessarily SATA just enhancements. These are enhancements that will affect the overall NGR capability. So NGR works very well today. We noticed that there is an ability to improve that model, and that's what we're embarking on with ESDR 4.
Okay. So one final question. If you guys have decided to go down the route of using a floor price, then all of this would be moot?
A floor price meaning allowing
that you're not having your price suppression.
Again, I think that hits on a couple different. No, I don't think that solves it. I think that there's still very much a question of efficiency and ratepayer benefit. I mean, having a resource bid at 1,000 when it could have bid lower, does not necessarily solve the issue. We have explored that potential, and to us, that was not kind of the panacea or silver bullet to kind of solve this short term and move forward to solve things later. Again, there were still a lot of participation questions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, great, thanks. Next question.
Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum again. I think I'm going to agree with Alex, which may be a little weird coming from WPTF. I'm not sure that there are price suppression issues here. If you start thinking about the NGR model in general, if you optimally bid in the resource, that essentially lowers the price as much as possible, because it is already a spread, right? If you look at the day-ahead market, it'll optimize the charge and discharge, and pretty much no matter what you bid, it'll take you and it'll discharge you in the highest price revenue or highest price LMP, and it'll charge you in the lowest. So an optimal bid will lower prices as much as possible. Like, there literally is no way to suppress the market beyond that. You could do it the other way, and I would imagine DMM could be concerned about that, and maybe the CAISO, where I could use my bids to raise prices. But I guess I don't understand where the suppression point is coming from, because how would you do it practically?
So the market price suppression piece is coming in only from the resources with a must-offer obligation, because they are getting additional cost recoveries for their market participation. For the options that don't include the must-offer obligation, they should be internalizing those costs, and so we are not worried about market price suppression in those instances. Questions about do market power exist for NGRs, and should we be looking at some type of market power mitigation for NGRs, I think is always a fair and interesting, reasonable question. We have market power mitigation tools for example, some of the resources that are utilizing similar functionality as to an NGR, but not necessarily to an limited energy storage resource, kind of the original NGR, if you will. So you can ask the questions about market power mitigation. That's fair. I just want to note that the questions about market price suppression were limited to certain project types.
Sure. So in that, let's go to the must-offer obligation then. Let's say you have a must-offer obligation, and I think you're proposing, 24 hours must-offer obligation? How would you suppress prices if you're under the NGR model? And maybe this is a question for Peter, but if you're bidding in, no matter what you bid, essentially either you're inefficiently increasing costs, or the optimization is dispatching you based on your charge and discharge. And the optimal way to do that is to lower the highest cost as possible and increase it during those valley hours. How can you inappropriately change the price of a storage resource?
Yeah, so this is Peter. So I'm not sure I can comment on that exact topic, but ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to look at our optimization opportunities on the resource. And today, when you move from a day-ahead market to a real-time market, the ISO will optimize that resource in real time to meet system conditions. And those system conditions might be a little bit different than what we encountered in day-ahead. And the issue that we have is, again, we're trying to protect that capacity to meet the obligation. So that will, what we're contemplating will improve our ability to meet the requirements of SATA, as well as other obligations like RA. And as part of this ESDR 4 initiative, we'll be looking at those opportunities.
And I'd just kind of like to add on to Peter's comments, which is to say, I noted this with Alex, but I guess I'll, again, just jump right into this. Our plan is to try and pursue resolution of SATA within a time frame that still does facilitate contemplation for the 2019-2020 TPP cycle. So the upcoming TPP cycle would not be lost. It's just an opportunity to develop some of the policy through ESDR, and then we can consume that policy progress here in SATA and move forward in that time frame. So again, we're not looking at this as something that is a loss in any way, shape, or form, so much as a pause button to allow necessary progress to occur in other initiatives so that we can utilize it here without costing us a TPP cycle.
I mean, I think it's great that you're going to look at this in ESDR 4, and I think there are definitely enhancements that Peter just said that will be very beneficial to the market. But I actually don't think that does anything for market price suppression, because I don't think market price suppression exists, even if you have a must offer. You certainly could have an inefficient dispatch between real-time and day-ahead, but I would just challenge you guys to think of an example yourself, and if you're going to point to market price suppression as something that needs to be fixed to move forward, I think that's going to be really hard, no matter what enhancements you make in ESDR 4. Thanks.
All right. Looking at the time, I did want to make sure that we covered a couple of the topics that the ISO is currently considering ESDR 4, but are there any quick questions on the phone?
I see one more question in queue. I'm not sure if it will be quick, but if you'd like, I can go to that line.
Sure, let's go to that line.
Okay. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, is this Jan from San Diego Gas Electric?
Hey,
just
Jan.
a couple of real quick things. One, I guess I tend to have the same question as Carrie and Alex. I mean, I struggle a little bit with where this price suppression actually can arise, but I'll leave that to you guys to sort out and explain. My other comment, though, I wanted to kind of give the other side of the coin that to Alex's remark that when a SATA is in a reliability period, it ought to be treated like unaccounted for energy, like transformer losses or something like that. I actually don't think that's a good idea. I think that involves less transparency. While I agree with Alex that it shouldn't be settled, quote unquote, through the market, it obviously has market impacts, and obviously it's costing people money to charge it. Obviously there's a benefit when it discharges. All of that needs to be rolled up in the reliability settlement, but I don't think it should be just ignored and treated like unaccounted for energy. I think that's moving us away from transparency. So I wanted to just give the other side of that. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, so I'm going to move on so we can wrap up and conclude on time. We're going to go back one slide. So again, as we noted, we think a lot of these issues are generally applicable to NGR. So we're going to start looking at, again, potential opportunities for spread bidding. We think this has a potential benefit in terms of opportunity cost calculation, which again, if this is something that we're going to apply, we apply generally to CC3, Commitment Cost Standards Phase 3 resources. If we can build that out to NGRs, that will be helpful, particularly if we continue to pursue the path where CPM and RMR resources are going to have opportunity cost calculations. Some of these, particularly the direct design resources, start to look a lot like those. So we think there's a lot of benefits to further exploring spread bidding. Where it ultimately ends up is obviously a TBD. But then I think what we're also going to be looking for is continuing to explore some of the tests and market commitments and additional potential market constraints to ensure that any day-ahead NGR awards are protected to maintain reliability into and through real time, whether those challenges be load or flow based. So again, part of this will be looking at the constraints through the ESDR 4 initiative, and once we get some resolution through that process, our expectation is that we will be able to pick this up again later this year once we've got some resolution, even if it's not what you would call board approved or final resolution. Once we got some consensus on that through ESER 4, we can reinitiate SATA later this year with, again, the hope that we can get it completed and in place for the next TPP cycle. So we've got that. With that, we've got 2 minutes to go. Are there any final comments or questions before we end the call?
And as a final reminder, you can press #2 on your telephone keypad if you do have a question.
Okay, I'm hearing silence. I'm assuming that there are no final questions. So with that, we'll conclude the call, and we'll look forward to reinitiating SATA later this year and your involvement in ESER 4 to get some of these issues resolved. So thank you very much.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may disconnect.